UFO. She is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal. Hello once again, dear listeners, to the Ghost Signal. My name's Jeff, and I will be your control operator this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you find yourself across the 24 time zones. If this is your first time dialing into the Ghost Signal, glad to have you along. But if you are a return listener, welcome back. This is episode 2, The House That Screams, in which we will take a look into the legend of the Screaming House of Union, Missouri. An interesting news article, some spooky activity in a college dormitory, and a small 3 a.m. PRI update. If you have a spooky story or creepy caper, or you have written a short story with a paranormal twist, visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and click the link to email me. The first 10 submittals I read on the show that also send a mailing address will get a 3x3 sticker with the Ghost Signal logo as a sign of my appreciation. And you can choose to remain anonymous if you wish. I also would like to inform you of the upcoming Patreon for the Ghost Signal. While details have yet to be finalized, there will be 2 tiers to start, a $1 per month and a $5 per month. There will be fun and unique benefits available, so choose the tier that's right for you. Today's topic is about the life-changing events that author and father of 3 Stephen LaChance experienced in the spring of 2001. And the legend of the house he lived in that, for all intents and purposes, behaved like a paranormal nuclear reactor. This story is not for the faint of heart, dear listener. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
On January 16, 1866, Captain John T. Crow, an officer of the 26th Missouri Infantry, judge, sheriff, and school board president, married Minerva Mary Breckenridge, member of the wealthy Breckenridge family of Kentucky. Together they owned a large swath of land in Union Township, an inheritance from Mary's family, where they would settle and raise their own family. Eventually, Captain Crow would marry 3 times, outliving each one. In later years, rumors of voodoo rituals being done on the property started to arise, as well as clandestine deals with the devil and infidelity. It is interesting to note that while Captain Crow fought for the Union in the war, he married into a family known to be slave-owning critics of slavery. I wish I could elaborate, but I'm not even sure what that means. In the early 1900s, Captain Crow sold his part of the property to future governor of Oklahoma, John C., with the rest going to the township of Union, becoming known as the Crow Edition. Captain Crow then moved to Beaufort, Missouri, where he spent the remainder of his days. In 1932, Sears and Roebuck delivered something called a house kit. bought from a catalog and delivered by train to unlisted parties who were then in possession of a section of Captain Crow's former land. These houses had to be constructed by the purchaser on site and were quite popular along the busy train lines of the time because of the relative ease of transportation, delivery, and assembly. Several existing buildings on the property were repurposed, including a Civil War-era infirmary that had previously been converted into a poorhouse. It is well documented that when someone living there died, their bodies would be laid to rest in mass graves scattered all across the property, one of which existed near where the house would be built. Also near this spot was the location of the slave quarters. When that structure was demolished, another house was put in its place. In 1974, a woman living in that house murdered her husband with an axe before taking her own life with one of his guns. Some accounts say that a former slave living on that very property had done the same exact thing roughly 100 years before. 6 Civil War soldiers were rumored to have been executed somewhere on the property. As recent as 1999, in a house directly across from the Screaming House, a man had committed suicide by gunshot right in front of his young son. Some say there are tunnels running underneath the house between it and the railway, some say the purpose of which was to smuggle slaves onto the property under cover of night. I would suspect, though, that these tunnels were primarily used for rum running during Prohibition. There were rumors of Minerva having an affair with at least one of her male slaves, which may have led to her death and the deaths of all young male slaves on the property. One of the sources giving details of this atrocity was an actual member of the family, and later the captain himself. It was into this maelstrom of negativity that Stephen LeChance and his family were unknowingly thrown in when he signed the rental agreement of the museum-like house on North Christina Avenue in Union, Missouri. In May of 2001, Stephen LeChance, a former true skeptic, found himself in desperate need of a new living situation. He was a single father of 3, Lydia being the oldest at 12, Michael the middle child at 11, and little Matthew was the youngest at 10. He needed to act fast or they would find themselves homeless. Like most of us who have found ourselves in this situation, time was of the essence, and the first reasonable deal to come along is usually the one we go with. After answering every possible ad available, and with no serious leads, prospects were definitely grim, until one day when he received a phone call from a friend. He was informed of an open house being held at an old place that was still in magnificent condition that upcoming Sunday. Compared to their little apartment, this house might as well have been Buckingham Palace. He had to have it. After a selective application process, the somewhat odd landlady decided that Stephen was the sort of tenant that understood the responsibility of living in an old house like this. He and his family moved in on the Friday before Memorial Day, May 25th. After the small family had somewhat settled in, he noticed something odd about the house's interior doors. They all had old-fashioned hook and eye latches on them, as many old houses do, but they were installed on the outside of the doors, as if they were trying to keep someone or something from getting out. A few days later, Stephen decided it was time to finish decorating the living room. Eventually, he came to a painting with 2 angels, which was meant to complement the cherubs that surrounded it, and set about to hanging it above the fireplace. As soon as it was on the wall, and he turned to walk away, Stephen heard a loud crash coming from behind him. The painting had fallen off the wall. Thinking rationally, he surmised that he had simply installed the wall hook wrong, cursed under his breath, and rehung it. Confident in his work, he once again turned to leave the living room when crash. It was on the floor again. Frustration mixed with unease washed over him as he hung the painting for the 3rd time. With this new attempt, he knew that there was no way the painting could possibly fall to the floor now without taking the wall it hung on with it. Stephen once again turned to leave the living room, the feeling of being creeped out now stronger than ever. He was ready to go do something else, anything else. As he was exiting the living room, an object slid across the floor and hit Stephen on the backs of his feet. It was the painting again. "What the hell?" he cursed. The strange thing is that when the picture hit the floor, it made no sound. How did this scoot across the floor without falling? Stephen wondered. He marched back across the living room, mischievous angel painting in hand, and hung it back up, saying, "Stay there, damn it!" And it did. A moment later, Lydia's voice rang out through the front door. "Dad, come see this!" As he stepped out onto his front porch and stood next to his daughter to see what was going on, he noticed every person walking on the sidewalk was refusing to walk on the section directly in front of their house. They were avoiding his house specifically, but why? "They don't like walking in front of our house, Dad. Isn't that weird?" she wondered. Maybe they are uncomfortable with new neighbors, he rationalized. This incident, combined with what had just happened in the living room with the painting just a few moments before, began to paint a sinister, albeit unbelievable picture in his mind. Nothing else happened for the rest of the day. That day. Late spring in Union, Missouri, which sits about 45 miles southwest of St. Louis, is pleasantly warm, almost summer-like. Even though the public swimming pools were open for the season, the kids still had 1 week left of school. Everyone just wanted to be outside, so when Stephen's mom dropped the kids off at home after church that Sunday, he had a day of yard work planned for them and himself, because for some unknown reason the trees in his yard, and only his yard, were shedding their leaves like autumn had set in. He made a mental note to ask the landlady about it the next time he spoke to her. The kids were excited to be outside. Spring fever had them in its rambunctious grip, and seeing as how they've never had a real yard before, having lived exclusively in apartments, they were eager to help with the yard. Kids eager to do yard work may be the most outlandish part of this whole story. Stephen decided that the weathered white of the house needed sprucing up. To accomplish this, he would need the garden hose that was still in the basement, so he sent Matthew to retrieve it, who agreed without complaint. A few short moments later, Stephen heard the sounds of his youngest child screaming. Not the playful screaming that kids make when playing in the backyard, but the type of scream that comes from someone who has been terrified beyond belief. Stephen ran inside to find his little boy shaking uncontrollably and standing in a puddle of his own urine. "What's wrong? What happened?" Stephen asked frantically. "Something chased me back up the stairs, Daddy," he mumbled. His voice was shaking so much it sounded like he was standing at the South Pole. "What chased you?" "I don't know, Daddy, but it was big." Unnerved, but still thinking it was Matthew's overactive imagination, Stephen, Lydia, and Michael went downstairs for a cursory inspection. Their search proved fruitless. Upon returning to the kitchen and seeing Matthew hadn't moved a muscle, the older two attempted to tease him as siblings are wont to do. Stephen sent a side-eye at them, the kind only a father of 3 can cast, and the teasing evaporated. "Let's get you cleaned up," said Stephen, with no further incident. These days would mark the end of what Stephen would later refer to as the normal happy time. It was at this point that all the light switches in the house seemed to become sentient. Monday, June 4th. Every day for that last week of school they would leave the house in the morning as usual, but when they returned in the evening, all the lights in the bedroom were on. Stephen, acting on pure dad instincts, scolded the kids for wasting electricity, and despite all protests to their innocence, he didn't believe them. By Friday, however, he had had enough. He sent the kids and himself through the house that morning, double and triple checking all of their lights. All were off. Stephen confirmed it himself. When they returned that evening, the results were the same. All the lights were on. Thinking that there must be an intruder, he swept and cleared the house and found nothing amiss. The first time the entity made its presence known to Stephen, it was Lydia that pointed out something unusual in the living room. "Daddy, it's cold in here," she stated. He looked at the thermostat and saw a 30-degree difference from where it was supposed to be to where it actually was. Suddenly, a sensation like an electric current shot through his entire body, bringing tears to his eyes and goosebumps to his skin. As soon as it started, it was over. What the hell was that? He thought to himself. The temperature in the room then returned to normal. That night, everyone slept in Stephen's bed. Sunday, June 10th, found Stephen and the kids watching TV in the living room. They were discussing and planning the next day's trip to Grandma's house, where the kids would be spending the upcoming week while he was in Indianapolis on business. He glanced over one of the kids' shoulders because something had caught his attention. Movement. It was there. Not a something, but a someone standing in the doorway, watching. A dark figure of a man made up completely of black and dark gray smoke swirling around, churning mindlessly. He looked down because surely his eyes were deceiving him. He slowed his thoughts down and assured himself, whatever that is, it isn't what you think it is, because that's impossible. Having gathered his courage, he looked up again. It was still there, and now it's moving. It floated to the center of the adjoining vacant family room, where it stood for just a few more moments, then disappeared. Stephen then found himself with a decision to make. Do I A, run out of here like a maniac like I so desperately want to do, and probably wind up at the nut house before dawn, or B, pretend that never really happened, calmly load the kids up into the car, and head on over to Mom's for the night? He realized he was petrified with fear and had barely taken a breath. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The option to stay in the house that night never existed. Change of plans, guys. We're going out for sodas and then we're going to Grandma's house. Right now. The kids were suspicious at first. Soda this close to bedtime? But then was quickly dismissed. Hell yeah, soda! Stephen grabbed his keys and out the door they went. He herded his brood to the car, but when he turned around to lock the door, an awful gut-wrenching scream of a man in absolute distress emanated from somewhere inside the house. It was so loud that the dogs all across the neighborhood started barking. As they were driving away, Matthew shouted, "Daddy, the basement shadow monster is in the upstairs window." Stephen looked back and saw that he was right. It was watching them leave. And this time, nobody teased Matthew. After that terrifying ordeal, Stephen left for his business trip, and the kids stayed with his parents. The fateful day when they would have to return to that house loomed overhead like a thunderstorm on the horizon, and sure enough, the following weekend it did. Stephen picked up his family and reluctantly headed home. That weekend was quiet, so he began to think that what had happened the previous weekend was long gone. Just a one-time thing. Monday, June 18th. Stephen was on the phone with his mom in the living room while the kids were all playing in his bedroom close by. It started quietly. A light rattle of the doorknob. He paid it no mind, but it grew louder with every passing moment. Stephen was beginning to have trouble ignoring it. "Cut it out," he scolded. "It's rude to do that while someone's on the phone." He thought the kids had gotten bored and decided to play a little prank on dear old Dad. The rattling didn't stop. It just kept getting louder and more intense. He apologized to his mother for the interruptions. "Kids, I told you to knock it off." The rattling instead grew to a disturbing strength. "Daddy, that's not us. I'm reading and the boys are asleep," said Lydia from his bedroom. As soon as the words left her mouth, the temperature in the house dropped by at least 30 degrees. Then came the return of that strange surge of energy, followed closely by a foul, obnoxious odor coming from out of the walls. After this came the screaming, starting off relatively quiet and quickly gaining in strength to a deafening crescendo. Through all that, he still heard all the bedroom doors upstairs slam shut on their own. "Come get us, Mom, please, come help us," he howled into the phone, right before he dropped the receiver. Next came the pounding on the walls. Boom, boom, screaming, boom. "Daddy, Daddy, what's happening?" Lydia screamed from behind the bedroom door. He could feel the banging in the walls reverberating off the floor as he went to free Lydia from his room. He could also sense the presence of something enormous following him, and he didn't turn around out of sheer fear. Boom! Screaming! Boom! Boom! He reached the door, but it wouldn't budge. Hitting, punching, and kicking the door proved useless. He could see that the door latch was undone, so there was nothing preventing him from opening that door. But still, he could not gain entry. "Please, God help me," he shouted, before giving the door one last mighty strike. And it worked. When he got inside, he found Lydia on the floor, in shock and unresponsive. Time was of the essence, and he could feel that whatever was in the house was watching him, so he gave Lydia a slap across the face. Harsh, yes, but it worked. She came to, and they ran out of that house as fast as they could, while the whatever it was chasing them mere inches away. When they got to the car, they found the boys standing next to it, ready to leave. As they drove to his mom's house, Stephen stopped on the top of the hill to watch an abject horror as it roamed from room to room, relentlessly searching for something. Dear God, Stephen thought it, searching for us. That was the last time the children would ever be in the house, but Stephen would not be so lucky. His ordeal would last years after he moved out, but that is a story for another time. Never fear, dear listener, because the story of the Union Screaming House is far from over and will return. But as for right now, the clock strikes midnight. Time to clock in for the graveyard shift. In this installment of the Graveyard Shift, I have two stories to bring to you today. In the first, we travel to the land down under, where a diamond ring was found along a quiet street in the sleepy beach town of Stanley, Tasmania. Recently, a post was published on the Facebook page of the Tasmanian police regarding a cursed ring, which aroused great curiosity among the local residents, who left many comments on it. The superstitious Australian who found the diamond ring 14 years ago finally turned it over to the police after he came to the conclusion that the ring began to bring him bad luck. The ring was mailed to Smithton Police in the seaside town of Stanley on the northwest coast of Tasmania and arrived there last week. The precious piece of jewelry with a large round diamond was delivered from an anonymous sender who attached only a short note to it, reading, "I found this ring on Alexander Terrace in 2007. Since then, I have had no luck. Sorry." The Smithton Police Department urged the owner of the ring to come forward and take the jewelry, because after the ring was sent, strange things began to happen at their police station. We would like to return this precious ring to its only true owner, because frankly, since it arrived, strange things have been happening here, the local police Facebook page read. Unfortunately, no details of the strange things were given, but however, this post quickly fired up the imaginations of residents and many of them share their theories in the comments. Creepy! I wonder where he found it, and under what circumstances. I hope eventually the real owner comes forward and fills in the blanks, one user wrote. Another remarked that the ring looked just like her mother's diamond ring, but they haven't seen their mother in over 10 years. Others speculate that the original owner discarded the ring in the first place to remove a curse from themselves. Kudos to whoever turned it into the police, though. After 14 years, I probably would have just pawned it. Our next story comes to us from Bill in North Carolina. It's set against the backdrop of tragedy, and while not overwhelmingly terrifying, it is definitely spooky enough to be my very first listener submission. In it, he writes, "In the spring of 1984, I was a student at Emporia State University in Kansas. I lived on the third floor of the dorms where one night, while some of my friends and I were watching TV, we heard someone sobbing hysterically through our windows. When we looked outside, we saw someone sitting on the steps of the front entrance in a very emotional state. Turns out he's also a resident of our dorm, but on the first floor, and he had just found his roommate dead. He had hanged himself from an overhead pipe that all dorm rooms had. When it all calmed down and the police and dorm staff were gone, we went to another friend's room where we all sat on the bed, which, incidentally, sat across the room from the locked door. We got into the deepest conversation about the dark thoughts he must have been having to kill himself in a busy dormitory. Click. Suddenly the lights went out. We were all laughing, ooh, ah, scary, trying to lighten the mood. I decided to be the brave one and went over to the switch to turn the lights back on. I said a little joke as I flipped the switch, and the lights came back on as expected. I turned around and got about 2 steps when, click, the lights turned themselves back off. None of us got any sleep that night, and it's never happened since." Don't forget, if you have a scary story, a creepy confession, or some ghoulish gossip, visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and you can submit them to me to read on the show. The clock has struck 3 a.m., the witching hour. This segment of the witching hour is pretty short as there's not much going on with 3 a.m. PRI at the moment. But that will soon be changing in a big way. We are going to be bringing you investigations from all over our Omaha Council Bluffs region in the upcoming year. If you know of any place that you think we should investigate, send your ideas to theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com. And that's it. Episode 2 has come to an end. Please email me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com if you would like to share your spookiness with the rest of the world. And don't forget to visit theghostsignalpodcast.com for all the latest updates in the launch of the Ghost Signal Patreon. With your help, dear listener, the sky is the limit, and I'm very excited to see where it leads. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson, custom sound beds by J.M. Scherf, video editing wizardry by Hale, and Patreon mastery by Brooks Bigley. And my name is Jeff, your friendly control operator and your ghost host with the most. The next time the Ghost Signal hits the airwaves, we will look at the true story of the events that inspired one of the most terrifying movies of all time, The Exorcist. Until then, dear listener, transmission terminated. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.